developments in the ongoing debt crisis and the EU response. And the first speaker is András Kármán, who is Minister for Taxation and Financial Regulation. Very warm welcome to the European Parliament and the debate.
President, honourable members, I fully understand the significant interest in this Parliament in the actions being undertaken within the Union and beyond to tackle the challenges which some Member States are facing in relation to their public finances. The global financial crisis has had a significant impact on both revenues and expenditure in all our countries, even if the extent and nature of that impact is not the same in all cases, and the capacity of individual Member States to handle the consequences are also very different. The first thing I would like to stress is that it is the Member States themselves which are first and foremost responsible for ensuring that their public finances are sustainable and on a sound footing. Similarly, it is for each one of them to ensure that their economies are competitive, flexible and resilient. Of course, that does not mean that public finances and economic performance are not also a matter of collective interest. We are part of a union and our economies are interlinked in a number of ways. Through the single market and in many cases through the sharing of the common currency and the deeper economic integration which that implies. More generally, we all have a commitment of solidarity towards each other based on a desire to protect and promote the wider European interest. What that means is that we all want to see a stable and strong economy across the EU as a whole and within it of the euro area in particular. Where necessary, this has to involve taking steps to ensure the stability of individual Member States. We have a number of tools at our disposal to do this. We have the coordination mechanism that seeks to ensure the appropriate economic and budgetary policies are pursued by each and every Member State. These are being updated and reinforced, and I am pleased that negotiations between the Council and the Parliament are advancing well. We also have access to the European Financial Stabilisation Mechanism, which can offer support at the EU level to any Member State, whether inside or outside the Eurozone. In addition, and for the Eurozone countries specifically, further instruments have been set up and are continuing to be developed. Greece has received a package of coordinated bilateral loans from Member States as well as a loan from the IMF. Ireland has received a package consisting of bilateral loans, a loan from the European Financial Stability Facility, EFSM, and also a loan from the IMF. And the support package for Portugal is being prepared, which will also draw on both European and IMF support. Ministers of the Eurozone Member States are also finalising the technical details of the European Stability Mechanism, which is due to take effect from 2013 as a permanent financial support mechanism to replace the European Financial Stability Facility. Non-Euro area Member States are also participating in this process. I would now like to turn briefly to the situation in the three Eurozone countries to which I have already referred. I should, however, signal that from the outset that many of the issues in relation to this Member State are discussed outside the regular ECOFIN format, reflecting their specific characteristics as member of the Eurozone. The chair of the Eurogroup would be better able than I am to give you further details on many of these points. So first on Ireland. Following agreement last December of an overall €85 billion assistance programme for Ireland, the Irish authorities have undertaken a great deal of work to implement the adjustment programme to which the financial support was attached. This programme has been kept under constant review with the new government. The ECOFIN Council will review compliance with the programme for the first quarter at its meeting on 17 May, next Tuesday. I cannot, of course, say much in advance of that discussion, but the overall assessment is likely to be that Ireland's performance is in line with expectations, but that some specific challenges remain. Ireland will in particular need to stick to the path of fiscal adjustment, as well as ensure that its financial sector is on a stable footing for the future. On Greece. Greece has come a long way since the very difficult situation last year, and its efforts should be commended. It has been faced with a daunting challenge and has demonstrated unwavering commitment and clarity of purpose. The adjustment programme is broadly on track. The latest implementation report, drafted jointly by the Commission, the IMF and the ECB in March, concluded that the programme has made further progress toward its objectives. Some of the reforms needed to deliver the programme's medium-term objectives are being put in place. The report also identifies further areas where reforms are required in order to build the critical mass necessary to ensure fiscal sustainability and economic recovery. The Commission, the ECB and the IMF continue to monitor closely progress in the implementation of the adjustment programme. The next review is scheduled for this month. The Member States that participate in the bilateral loan agreed in March to reduce the interest rate by 1% and to extend the maturity of the loan. This is also a positive development. The technical details for the implementation of this agreement are currently under discussion. Finally, in Portugal. On 6 April, the Portuguese caretaker government announced its intention to seek financial assistance from the European Union. This followed a period of intense pressure from the financial markets. However, Portugal was also going through a period of political uncertainty, which, as we know, led to a resignation of the government on 24 March. The Portuguese Parliament had previously rejected the new fiscal consolidation package proposed by the government. Negotiations between the Troika and the Portuguese authorities have now been finalised, and the Memorandum of Understanding on the policy conditions attached to the financial assistance is being agreed. The financial envelope will be around €78 billion, covering a 3-year period. In line with recommendation by ECOFIN minister at the informal ECOFIN in Budapest in April, the programme covers reform in a number of areas, including public finance, labour and product markets, and the financial sector. We consider that such measures are essential for growth potential and increased economic stability. Endorsement of the final financial package is expected also at next week's ECOFIN Council. President, honourable members, this is only a brief overview of the measures being taken to address the impact of the global financial crisis on the EU and on 3 member states in particular. As I said at the outset, the Hungarian presidency is not directly involved in all of the detailed negotiations, some of which fall more correctly within the remit of the Eurogroup. The presidency is, however, committed to doing its part to assist in ensuring that all necessary measures are in place to address the current problems. We consider that this is essential if we are to boost Europe's competitiveness over the longer term and, in so doing, deliver the strong growth which Europe as a whole needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And now for the Commission, Mr. Rehn.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, Europe's economic outlook today is quite dualistic. On the one hand, the recovery in the real economy has taken hold and is becoming more solid and self-sustaining. On the other hand, it is uneven, and we still face turbulence in the financial markets, especially in the sovereign debt markets. Thus, the key task of the EU's economic policy now is to contain the sovereign debt crisis and thus to protect the ongoing recovery in the real economy of Europe. Now, with the EU-IMF programme of Portugal waiting for its adoption next Monday in the Eurogroup ECOFIN meeting, we are turning another chapter in this necessary endeavour. Last week, the Portuguese government presented an economic reform programme following our productive negotiations with the government, the opposition, the civil society, the social partners and the academic world. These talks are reflected in the programme. It is a Portuguese programme that deserves the support of the European Union and of the International Monetary Fund. Our joint assistance of €78 billion shows the strong commitment to help Portugal and to safeguard financial stability of Europe. It is a demanding but fair and necessary programme of adjustment. Yes, it will require major efforts from the Portuguese people. Great attention has been paid in its preparation to social fairness and protecting the vulnerable. Europe stands by Portugal for the sake of the country and for the sake of economic stability in Europe. Honourable members, with view to the recent developments, it would be wrong to say that the debt crisis were no longer a burden for the European economy. Yet it would be equally wrong to claim that the EU has not responded to the crisis. Consider this: only a year ago, the euro area member states agreed on a conditional loan package to Greece in order to prevent a meltdown of our financial system. Within this 1 year, from last May until today, we have created effective stability mechanisms, first temporary and then to be turned permanent as of 2013. We are implementing a very systematic programme of fiscal consolidation in all member states, and they are committed to bold structural reforms to boost growth and job creation. We are, with your active support, addressing the systemic weaknesses in EU economic governance to prepare for a profound change in the policy-making landscape of the European Union. And we are, again with your support, addressing the shortcomings of our integrated financial market by toughening financial regulation and implementing the new supervisory architecture. At the present juncture, financial stability is being safeguarded by the EU-IMF stability mechanisms and especially by the actions that the member states, especially the vulnerable member states, are themselves taking. Still, some people argue that the crisis management strategy, especially with regard to Greece, is failing. I disagree with this view. The first and foremost objective of our strategy has been to prevent another cardiac arrest of the kind that followed the failure of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 and subsequently led to the financial crisis and economic recession worldwide. We have done that and thus protected the ongoing recovery in the real economy in Europe. Secondly, we have been able to largely contain the distress in the sovereign debt markets to the 3 countries in the programme. As seen in the bond spreads, Spain is decoupling from these countries thanks to its determined action in fiscal, financial and structural fronts. Thirdly, the programmes in both Greece and Ireland are still in the relatively early stages. The Greek programme has run for 1 year and in Ireland about 5 months out of 3 years of the programme. Both countries are pursuing very ambitious programmes of fiscal consolidation, structural reform and financial repair. Our review mission is currently in Athens with the ECB and the IMF to assess the implementation of the programme and to prepare an updated analysis of debt sustainability of Greece. The work will be concluded in the coming weeks, which will facilitate well-informed decisions. In any event, while the report over the past year is in fact unprecedented, over 7% of GDP or 20 billion euros, it is clear that Greece has to seriously reinforce the implementation of the economic reforms and achieve a breakthrough in the privatisation programme and then ensure its implementation. It is absolutely necessary and urgent that the domestic disputes are put aside and a cross-party support achieved for the recovery of Greece. It is really an illusion to think that there were any real alternatives to the economic reform. This is therefore a real test of credibility of the Greek political forces, both government and opposition, and ultimately of the will of the Greek people. Honourable members, the present stage of the crisis is a severely intertwined combination of a sovereign debt crisis and banking sector fragilities. We cannot solve one without solving the other. We must resolve both in parallel. And therefore, the banking sector repair must be completed to safeguard the provision of credit to the real economy, to enterprises, households, individual citizens. A new round of bank stress tests is being conducted. The results will guide the necessary restructuring and recapitalisation of the banking sector. And ahead of the publication of the results, the Member States will need to release their strategies for possible restructuring or recapitalisation of their vulnerable institutions. Such plans should be ready as soon as possible and include a detailed timeline. President, honourable members, let me conclude. The fundamental reforms of financial regulation and economic governance in the European Union are indeed profoundly changing the economic financial architecture of Europe. In the near future, a whole new set of rules will provide the basis for stable and sustainable growth and job creation. In the meantime, we must continue our work to safeguard financial stability and thus to protect the economic recovery in Europe, which is the key for sustainable growth. And this calls still for very difficult decisions at the European and at the national levels. I trust we all have the wisdom and courage to take such decisions. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ κύριε Επίτροπε. Τώρα περνάμε στους ομιλητές εξ ονόματος των πολιτικών ομάδων.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now speakers on behalf of political groups. Mrs. WORTMANN-KOOL, 2 minutes for the EPP.
Mr. Kármán.
Thank you so much, President. I'd like to thank both the Minister Kármán and Commissioner I'd like to thank them for their clarifications. Now, what we've seen over the last few weeks is that the situation gets worse for the entire community, for the member states in the euro, if the situation is shaky. Now, and then to actually hold a secret meeting which is then denied, it makes things even worse. It makes the markets even less stable. Now, President, I think that it is no longer possible to come up with simple solutions. The measures, support measures for Greece, Ireland and Portugal need to be strong, need to be robust to make sure that confidence comes back. We need to find a package which leads to economic growth and does away with public expenditure, which is unnecessary. So let us look very carefully at these countries in the coming weeks and months so that we can avoid further difficulties in a year's time. President, it's important to take decisions in June in terms of ambitious measures for the legislation around economic measures to find the trust of the markets. This is important for citizens. We need to get growth, we need to get employment, and the cohesion of our economies needs to be strengthened. That is why I'd like to call upon the Council to support the Parliament's ambitions, more accountability and a public debate in this House, more involvement of national parliaments. Let us not have any kind of swapping practices in the Council. If you don't like the decisions, we need to have a strong monetary pillar but also an economic pillar, and the Europe 2020 strategy to make sure that our social market economy can be sustained for the 27 member states. And I call upon you to take decisive measures in ECOFIN next week. Thank you.
Ms. There's a blue card for you. Will you accept a question?
Mr. Madlener.
From Mr. Madlener? Yes or no? Yes. Go ahead.
Ja, voorzitter, dank u wel.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Mrs. Wortmann-Kool, I have a question for you. Now, as a Dutch Member of Parliament, you can't talk about the scandals, the scandalous situation of the Minister of Finance of the Netherlands, who's not been invited to this summit last week. Why? The Netherlands is paying out so much. You, as a Dutch Member of Parliament, are not talking about this. Within the interest of the Dutch taxpayer, you see that billions of euros are being thrown into a bottomless pit. Well, I clearly said what we need to find trust, to find this trust again, and Mr. Madlener's simple solutions are not just going to make it harder for the Dutch citizens, but for citizens all over Europe. They're going to bring us into a situation which is worse. And I think it is shameful, really, for Mr. Madlener not to understand this. Thank you.
Well, now, on behalf of the Socialist Group, Mrs. Podimata, 2 minutes and a half.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, it's a year since the Greek adjustment program was agreed, and now we also have the one for Portugal. A year is a suitable time for review to see what has worked and what hasn't. Portugal and Ireland haven't been able to obtain financing from the market, and so they've needed help from the financial mechanism. There are specific problems in the countries as reflected in the programs, but the fundamental problem is the same, one of financial consolidation. In the case of Greece, the deficit has been brought down by 7% and new borrowing by 5%. but spending continues to be cut. The objective has to be to overcome the social crisis. The danger of sowing fear is that Euroscepticism will spread. The markets are not reacting properly to the programs. The Deauville decision to include private creditors has made things worse. There have been successes under these programs, but they are in danger of being lost if we continue to get things like new restructuring on the agenda, or the bankruptcy of a country, other things that are mentioned, albeit subsequently denied. These are things which were unthinkable in the future. You're as committed to Europe as myself, but we have to make sure we overcome the crisis in a way that people believe more in Europe. I think and believe that we should understand the significance of the present time. We shouldn't paint the situation in dark colours. It should be an opportunity to achieve a bolder and stronger EU for the future.
Now, for the Liberals, Mr. Haglund, a minute and a half. Thank you, President. Commissioner. My colleague has said that a year is a good time to look back over, and I can say hello from Finland and hope that our parliament is now going to support this. We have to hope this, at least my party is behind it. Now, when we look at whether Finland should support this or not, the one reason is, well, of course, you shouldn't shoot the messenger of the Hungarian presidency, but we're taking small decisions, and we can't solve everything all at once, and there is no panacea. We're constantly forced to take these small decisions, and then we have to have the political tolerance and will to follow this along. And that's not the case in all national parliaments. And we are worried that there are going to be even more difficult decisions. And so the Council is going to have to think of a more ambitious solution. And if they don't do this, we're not going to get out of this tough spot. So I think we have to have a new strategy. Thank you very much.
Εξ ονόματος των συντηρητικών μεταρρυθμιστών, η κυρία Φόρντ για 1 λεπτό.
Mrs. Ford, for 1 minute.
Commissioner, the sovereign debt crisis won't be solved until the banks are sorted out. And you can't sort out the banks if regulators' stress tests refuse to admit that the sovereign debt crisis exists. There's also a public confidence crisis. Some countries bailed out their own banks at huge cost to the taxpayers without any handouts from the EU. And I understand why the same public is now asking why they should fund bailouts in other countries. But last week's proposals for reform in Portugal had some positive recommendations for improving competitiveness. But the situation in Greece seems dire. Eurozone leaders tell us that there is no Greek debt restructuring, but since when was a delay of a repayment date not a restructuring? If public lenders extend their maturities, that's not just a shuffling of deck chairs on the Titanic. It's taking the public lenders below decks to sink in the ship, while the private loan holders are helped away to the lifeboats.
Now for the Greens. Mr. Giegold, 2.5 minutes.
Mr. President, Mr. Rehn, I'd like to start by saying that you described a situation which has deteriorated. In the Eurozone, there is an ever bigger gap between countries which are improving and countries which are continuing to struggle. I have some questions for you. As Monetary Commissioner, there's now more than 400 billion euro which are needed in the European Central Bank's accounts, which shows that the banks are unable to obtain financing on the market. When will the Commission produce a proposal for a restructuring system? How do you explain the delay as Monetary Commissioner? We Greens predicted long ago that the measures for Greece and Portugal would be ineffective as long as the macroeconomic conditions in the Eurozone did not improve. These countries have huge interest rate burdens. There's capital flight from some of these countries, and there's still a lack of demand, especially from the strong euro countries. We also have rising food prices and commodity prices, especially recently. Apart from the bailouts for these countries, apart from the help on the financial side, what measures will be taken so that these countries can make progress on external demand, interest rates, to alleviate their situation? Perhaps you could produce something which would improve the macroeconomic situation in the Eurozone. I believe that in Greece, Portugal and Spain, it is the poorest people who've been hit hard, and the wealthy haven't been made to pay. This is against the spirit of the treaties. Thank you.
Για την αριστερά, η κυρία Figueiredo.
And now, for the GUE, Mrs. Figueiredo, one minute.
Thank you so much, President. What I'd like to do is I'd like to express my indignation for the situation in Portugal because of the policies that have led to this situation, the program which has been imposed upon Portugal by the European institutional troika, which has taken this shameful act. It's external interference, and they have not really respected the sovereignty and the competence of the national parliament, and particularly faced with the elections. These are antisocial measures which make the people of Portugal, the workers of Portugal, worse off. They will turn Portugal into an country extremely dependent, a colony of European powers. And these measures are not really going to solve anything. Look at Greece. Take Greece as an example. We need to shoulder the responsibility of European policies in the light of the Portuguese situation. For instance, the policy of the strong euro, the Growth and Stability Pact, has not taken account of the fragile economies. What is the point of applying a package to Portugal, a package which will make us pay higher interest rates, much higher than the ones that are usually available on the market? Now, faced with the expressions of solidarity during our election campaign, we have an economic recession, and this economic recession is getting worse. So what you're doing is you're benefiting international banks. Some international financial and Portuguese institutions are being promoted in this manner. So what we're calling into question is the Eurozone as such, and this is an implosion, the implosion of the Eurozone. The speaker is interrupted.
I have cut off your microphone, I'm afraid. I apologize for this, but you went quite over time. You do have a chance, however, for another 30 seconds if you agree to answer to a blue card by Mr. Van Dalen. Κύριε Van Dalen, 30 δευτερόλεπτα.
Mr. Van Dalen.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask Mrs. Figueiredo a question. Now, if everything is so terrible in your country, and if things are in such a terrible situation that you're going to be faced with a regime where your economy has to be restructured, why don't you leave the Eurozone if it's all so terrible? Leave the Eurozone. I mean, the euro is a strong currency, and it has to be an important currency. If you mind having a strong currency, then just leave.
30 δευτερόλεπτα.
Mrs. Figueiredo, 30 seconds. I think what is really inadmissible is that you put this kind of question here in this House when European institutions have not been capable of shouldering the responsibilities of their own policies. The situation of the Portuguese economy, well, Portugal had a fragile economy to start off with, and it was subjected to the strong euro policies, and that is to the benefit of France, of Germany and others, but certainly it does not serve the interests of countries with more fragile economies. That is why the people of Portugal are fighting against these policies, just like in Greece, where the workers are fighting against these measures. We need a different kind of policy in Europe.
Mrs. Figueiredo. Obrigado, obrigado, yes, but this is, you know, the nth time that you exceed your time. Please, kindly, try to keep in time. Για την Ευρώπη Ελευθερίας και Δημοκρατίας,
And now for the EFD group, Mr. Bloom, 2 minutes.
I'm a baby boomer. I was born just after the war. We've probably had the longest period of peace and prosperity globally, I would say, from that time. I've put a little bit of modest money away so I can hand something down to my family when I pass on, largely because I've never spent more money than I've earned, and I've been prudent, and I've worked moderately hard. Now, it always seems to me as a complete surprise to politicians how countries get in debt. Let me explain, because I don't think you really understand it. It's because politicians consistently spend more money than they raise in taxation, more money than they can possibly raise in taxation, most of which, in point of fact, they actually waste. The reason we're talking about countries which are broke, and they are broke, is because they're ridiculous, ineffective, ignorant politicians consistently spend more money than they can raise. And then they borrow, and worse, they then print money because politicians and their central banks have a machine which prints money. You do that as a private citizen, and it's a criminal offence. You would go to prison for doing that, and politicians and their central banks do it all the time. Let me explain to you that these countries are broke. And they're broke because of their own stupid leadership and politicians, and it's immoral to ask ordinary taxpayers of any country to pick up the tab for failed politicians and failed banks. They are defaulted, they're broke. For God's sake, let's all of us admit it.
Κύριε Bloom, έχετε μία μπλε κάρτα.
Mr. Bloom? Yes, well, thank you very much. Mr. Goebbels is brandishing his blue card.
You accept the question? Mr. Goebbels, 30 seconds.
President, I'd like to know if Mr. Bloom knows that Spain is less in debt than the UK, that Ireland was under 60% before the banking crisis, and that Ireland, in going to debt save its banks, saved the money of the British banks.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I wasn't suggesting my politicians were any less stupid than anybody else. It's an absolute disgrace. And it wasn't even debated in our national parliament to actually rescue these bust banks. If you want to invest in bust banks, do so with your own money, not money from my old age pensioners in Yorkshire on 98 quid a week. You scoundrels.
Εξ ονόματος των μη εγγραμμένων, η κυρία Λεπέν.
Well, now, on behalf of the non-attached, Mrs. Le Pen. On the 9th of May 2010, the Troika, EU, ECB, IMF announced in triumph that they'd saved Greece from total bankruptcy through a loan of 110 billion euros. 1 year later, Greece is in recession. The public debt is 150% of GDP, and its interest rates are 25% a year. If today Greece is at the end of the road, it's that the method used to save it hasn't been right. Now that the Greek economy would need a weak currency to get out of the depression, the Troika is going to impose a new budgetary austerity plan. No more than yesterday, this remedy won't be effective tomorrow. In fact, the punitive interest rates that affect Greece today prevent its private economy from carrying out the least investment, whether it's in the productive apparatus or in real estate. Greece is becoming a third world country. The project of a new plan of 60 billion to save Greece envisaged last Friday shows that the loan of 110 billion already consented a year ago is being considered like a gift. Up until when do the European taxpayers have to carry out the Sisyphean task? Greece is insolvable. The CDS on the default risk of its public debt is 72%. The country is on the verge of social and political explosion. Persevering along this road is suicidal and would lead Europe to breakdown. Two solutions are possible. Either the restructuring of the Greek debt, with the key, the restructuring of all of the public debt of the states in difficulty, but finally the failure of our whole system, or a concerted solution of the Eurozone, making it possible for Greece to catch its breath, even if it comes back in a few years with this change to adapt to its economic reality. Now we're going to start with the other speakers. Mr. FEIO, 2 minutes.
Senhor Presidente, Senhor Representante do Conselho, Senhor Comissário.
President, Representative Council, Commissioner, the crisis managed through sovereign debt requires for a European solution, taking account of the different situations that exist. It should defend a strong Europe. And that is why all the proposals that are being discussed in the European Parliament at the moment on economic governance is so important. The European Parliament has made it possible for positive steps to be taken for an intelligent management of debt and to have a reasonable transitional phase, and to make sure that the reasonable reduction of the debt is not done year after year, but over a period of 3 years with budgetary discipline, defending the need for growth, more transparency in economic policies through debates here in the European Parliament, and also defending the solidarity, which is, I think, what happened in Portugal. As a Portuguese, I'd like to say the following. Portugal is 900 years old, and Portugal is capable of putting its public accounts right to redress its situation. We can reform our banking sector, our labour market, our taxation system and our health system. Portugal is capable of having a public administration that is more efficient, that is well controlled. We are capable of being a liberal economy, a successful economy, an economy which is competitive. But Portugal is also capable of participating in the European project by helping those other challenges that we are faced with in the future. So we feel very comfortable within the Eurozone, and we would like to strengthen this zone. Thank you.
Mr. Goebbels, 2 minutes.
Rumeurs folles et aux attaques spéculatives contre certains États.
With the speculative attacks on certain countries, let me remind you this. The euro is a strong currency. In 10 years, the euro has established itself as the second most used currency in the world. 13% of international transactions are in euro. More than a third of international loans are in euro. The euro has a 40% greater purchasing power than the US dollar. That means oil is cheaper for the Europeans. Whatever Mrs. Le Pen says, it is not possible for a country just to leave the euro. Any country leaving the euro, and Mrs. Le Pen wants to do that for France, would see its new currency drastically devalued. Following the crisis in Iceland, the value of the Icelandic currency was halved. That 50% devaluation in the Icelandic krona led inflation to rise from 5 to 14%. The way to calm the markets and to allow Greece, Ireland, Portugal and other countries to restructure their debts is to issue euro bonds guaranteed by the Union at reasonable rates. I refer here to the Monti Juncker initiative. Eurobonds exist already. The EIB lends. Last year, the EIB raised 80 billion euro at rates of 2 or 3%. That sort of rate of borrowing would help those countries return to the path of financial stability.
Dear colleagues, listen up. We are behind time, and there's a great interest in blue cards. Now, I'd like to give them, but I'll be forced at some point to stop doing so. Kindly do not misunderstand my change of position as anything other than the fact that time is pressing. At any rate, I give only one blue card per speaker, and here Mr. Helmer and Ms. Ford have asked for the floor. Can you agree among yourselves who's going to take the time? Mr. Helmer was first, so I'm afraid Mr. Helmer has the floor. Mr. Helmer, 30 seconds. Question.
Mr. President, the previous speaker said that if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, its currency would collapse. But in that case, it would default. However, we know perfectly well that it's going to default anyway. So it has a choice of defaulting within the euro, which merely kicks the problem down the road and it will return to bite us, or it can default outside the euro, in which case it can solve its problem. So his solution will not work.
Mr. Helmer, blue card is a question, it's not a statement. Nevertheless, I will give now the floor to Mr. Goebbels to answer. Mr. Goebbels.
Monsieur le Président, je n'ai pas...
Thank you, Mr. President. I wasn't blessed with a question, merely a statement by Mr. Helmer, but he's wrong. Mr. Helmer is wrong. A country leaving the euro would see its new currency drastically devalued. I refer to my Icelandic example. Iceland is not in the euro, but it's been through all this.
Mr. Schmidt.
Thank you, President. I'd like to say that I think Commissioner Rehn is doing excellent work. During this year, you've put forward a lot of proposals that have improved the situation, and I think we all have to recognize that. Now, I'd become very surprised when I listened to this debate. I thought that I was in a European house here, not a house representing 27 different member states. I mean, there's a nationalism here which I think is almost frightening. And that's not going to help our problem. It's solidarity we need.
But you are wrong. You are definitely wrong, Mr. Helmer. Because it's about solidarity. Europe is about solidarity. And we all are linked together. Even pound sterling is reflecting on the euro. I'm astonished. I'm astonished. Herr talman, jag återvänder.
I'll go back to my mother tongue, President. Now, in Sweden, we've experienced what it means to have high debts, a country indebted, people indebted, and we managed it. Why shouldn't our friends in Greece and Portugal and Ireland not be able to manage it? Should there be something special about us? But right now, they need our help and our assistance. And if we don't give them this help and this assistance, then we are going to fall as well.
Destiny for us all. And we have to realize that. Even you, Mr. Helmer, you are a part of Europe and you can do more. You are. Thank you.
Mr. Bokros, 1 minute.
These days we celebrate the first anniversary of the Greek bailout, but there is nothing to celebrate. 1 year later we are back in square one. Instead of lengthening the pain and pile up even more burden on the Greek economy, it would be far better to accept the inevitable and the judgment of the markets. No way to avoid default. An orderly default has at least 5 advantages. sharing the loss more fairly between Greek taxpayers and external creditors, stopping the replacement of private debt by ever-growing proportion of official debt coming from other countries, more growth opportunities offered to Greece by alleviating debt service, much easier for Madam Merkel to sell the default package in the Bundestag because it means supporting German banks rather than Greece, and finally isolate the debt crisis from the competitiveness crisis and save the Eurozone from contagion. Do it. Don't throw good money after bad.
Ms. Lamberts. 2 minutes.
Monsieur Bokros, je vais continuer puisque vous avez très bien introduit.
Mr. Bokros, that was an excellent introduction to the point. I can continue. Mr. Rehn, I think it's worth listening to what's said here. If you look at the figures, you see that a restructuring of the Greek and probably Irish debt is inevitable. I think everybody realized this. Sometimes things are so obvious that you have to wonder why the ECB, Commission and Council can't see it. Perhaps you're refusing to see it. Maybe there are ideological reasons for that. Perhaps you say there can be no restructuring, but I think that's you're in denial. Or maybe you're playing for time. And here I would appeal to you, because the more time goes by, the more the restructuring will be expensive and painful. It will cost the taxpayers a great deal. The more time goes by, Greek debt is increasingly held by the public authorities, in particular the ECB, so it's taxpayers who will have to pay. An awful lot is said, Mr. Rehn, about stress tests. We've got them for banks and nuclear power plants. But the people who are subjected to the greatest stress are our fellow citizens, especially the most disadvantaged in society. Those who are having to foot the bill for this crisis. It's very easy to say there's a crisis of banks and crisis of businesses, or some people say the crisis is something for the politicians are responsible for. But the fact is, everybody has to play their part. Although I often have to disagree with you, Mr. Rehn, I have to pay tribute to the work you've done recently. I suppose you don't get much sleep these days, and one day, when your life's a bit quieter, I'll gladly invite you to dinner.
Mr. Chountis, 1 minute. President in Office of Council and Commissioner, I expected of you that you would recognize that the austerity program that was imposed on Greece has been a failure in terms of the deficit. They're not meeting what was projected. The debt's increased it, unemployment's increased it, austerity is increasing. And in all of that, where do you see any recovery? And the fact that we've actually saved the patient. And then you're applying the same solution in Ireland and Portugal when it actually failed totally. At the same time, we see that figures demonstrate that Germany, yes, is resuming its growth, and its exports are achieving a record in relation to the 1950s, or in comparison to the 1950s. So we have to see what the problem is and what the cause of the problem is, and I don't know what you're waiting for to change your policy. I really wonder what you discuss in your secret meetings, because we hear all kinds of things, but are you really going to change your policy to solve the problems?
Ja, dank u wel voor.
Mrs. Madlener, Mr. Madlener, minute and a half. I have a question for Commissioner Rehn. How is it possible, Commissioner, that you had this Eurogroup meeting led by Mr. Juncker, and the Dutch Minister of Finance was not asked, was not invited? How can this be possible? I mean, the Dutch are paying and bailing out these countries to a large extent. So, Mr. Rehn, can you promise me that this is never going to happen again? Colleagues, yes, Greece will have to leave the euro or it'll have to restructure its debt. This is unavoidable, but the question really is, when will this happen? And I believe, or I fear, that this will happen once all the guarantees and all the money has been sent to Greece. And this will be a real treason, the treason of the century. Mr. Rehn, can you promise us that the Greek are refinancing their debt through loans from the Netherlands, and then after that they leave, and then all of a sudden the debt has to be rescheduled entirely? I know the Greek authorities joined the euro under false pretenses, and now these are simply people we cannot trust. So how can you guarantee, Mr. Rehn, that the Dutch taxpayer will not be treated so badly again?
Mr. Goebbels, I've been very generous to you in this debate. I will give you this blue card. This is the last thing you've seen from me. Okay, fair enough. Will you accept a question from Mr. Goebbels? 30 seconds. Go ahead, Mr. Goebbels.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Well, President, for the very last time, Mr. Madlener, who seems to be pleading against solidarity, against Greece, he probably knows that after the Netherlands and Germany are the two beneficiaries of the European market, and every second job in the Netherlands comes from exports of services and goods towards the European Union. Surely you cannot be speaking against the jobs that are created in the Netherlands? Mr. Madlener. Well, Mr. Goebbels, surely you should know that the good position of the Netherlands is thanks to the very hard work and having done our homework. Do you know that the Netherlands is the largest net payer for many years? And do you know that Greeks are those who receive the largest amount of money from the Netherlands? This has led to a crisis. So the whole thing seems to have gone wrong. I think it is the use of Dutch taxpayers' money which has been wasted in Greece. Mrs. Hübner, 2 minutes.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, our duty is to look for the best solutions to cope with the crisis, and in this effort the learning process is of great value. And my feeling is that we have learned why things went wrong and how we got ourselves into the difficult situation we are in today. But my feeling is also that now we are less open to drawing lessons from the evolving reality. In this context, I would like to touch upon two issues. First, we can see great similarities with regard to public debts and deficit ratios between member states, while at the same time, for the same member states, there are substantial differences between the risk premiums paid on their sovereign debt. And this is, in my view, a clear proof that factors other than sovereign debt enter into the picture and influence markets. Among others, it is foreign debt or excessive external imbalances on which markets focus. And this clearly means that in responding to the situation, we must go beyond fiscal adjustment. And the second issue I would like to raise is related to the fact that those economies that are the most strongly affected by the crisis have to cope with a combination of high risk premiums and severe austerity measures. This double challenge makes achieving debt sustainability practically impossible. If we reject debt restructuring, then we need a better balance between punishment and assistance and the design of response packages which would allow to avoid pushing countries further into a debt trap. Thank you.
Mrs. Estrela, 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. President, Commissioner, representative of the Council. Europe is faced with a serious crisis which can really endanger the Eurozone and the European project as a whole. It is a crisis of the Eurozone which Greece, Ireland and Portugal are the first victims of. The attacks to sovereign debt of these countries are basically there to make our single currency more fragile. I mean, don't believe those who say that this is an Irish, Greek and Portuguese problem. No, You need to find a firm answer on the part of Europe. You need to calm the markets, because if not, the pressure will continue and it will be extended to other countries. It is not the Portuguese problem of insolvency or insolvency of its banks, or the fact that their public accounts are wrong. No, Portugal needs to continue restructuring many of its businesses. It needs to increase productivity and it needs to promote economic growth. Just like in the past, the Portuguese will be in a position to overcome these problems. We will make the necessary sacrifices. But that is all. What we don't understand is that the European Union is going to be charging Portugal higher interest rates than the IMF. Portugal is going to be paying the European Union about 3 billion euros in interests per annum. So Mr. Bloom and Madlener, they should rest assured, surely, and especially, and also those who are not in the hemicycle, you can also rest assured, because you will not be losing out. The taxpayer is not going to be losing out. It's a loan. It's a loan. It's not a gift. It's a loan which is going to be reimbursed with interest rates which are higher than the ones that Portugal was paying on the market a month ago. In a globalized world, a single country cannot solve its problem on its own, and the financial crisis has clearly shown that what happens across the world can have a devastating effect on our own house. That is why we need a better, a stronger, and a more united Europe, a more ambitious Europe. We're all on this boat, and if it sinks, we're all going to sink with it. Thank you.
Estrela, you want to ask Mrs.
You have a question, do you, for Mrs. Estrela?
I have good news for the Portuguese. I can confirm that agreement has been reached in Finland, and the Commission proposal has been agreed to. Finland is no longer an obstacle. As I'm supposed to ask a question, I will do that. Do you believe that this belt tightening in Portugal will lead to sufficient gains that the debts will be paid off?
30 seconds, Mrs. Estrela.
Thank you so much for that information. I'd like to thank all the Finnish people in the Finnish Parliament for having taken this decision. This is a decision which goes precisely along the lines of solidarity, of European spirit, which presided over the creation of the European Union. Now, as far as your question goes, austerity measures will be met by the Portuguese. And despite the fact that this is a tough a package, we will do everything we can to increase economic growth, to create jobs, and to get out of this difficulty. Thank you. Mr. Goerens, minute and a half.
Thank you, President. Now, the problem of the debt is taking on a scope which goes beyond our budgets. It's general policy which is aimed at by this crisis in public debt. Budgetary areas, economic areas, social areas, national areas, they're all affected. But above all, it's a political crisis. In Finland, a party which made a plank of its platform lack of solidarity with Portugal shows how public opinion is worried about this. Now, the party of the real Finlanders, who preach refusing to help the Portuguese, resemble what the German politicians were saying a year ago when it was a time of giving aid to Greece. Now, the populist slogans which make it possible to win elections in Finland tomorrow in another country only relate statements made earlier by very respectable politicians. It's in this the political center that these ideas are generated that are undermining the economic union. And I think that these difficulties can only be surmounted if our political leaders understand if the euro consists of saving the euro means that we have to reassure people and reduce tensions.
Mr. Toussas, 1 minute.
It is not true that the financial crisis is a debt crisis. It's a crisis of capitalism and capital accumulation. There is a crisis of capitalism in Greece and Portugal, which is having an effect beyond those countries' borders. Big business and monopolies have had tax breaks. The handicrafts and small businesses in the textile and other sectors have been destroyed, and production has been moved to other countries. The beneficiaries are the big businesses. And now capital is being played off against the income of the workers in the name of Europe. Now there are references to bankruptcy of a country. It's clear that the workers are going to be made to pay, yet it is the workers who deserve our support.
Κύριε Τούσα, σας έχω κόψει το μικρόφωνο. Σας έχω κόψει το μικρόφωνο.
You don't have microphone. I've cut you off. I already told you in the past that perhaps you should buy a watch. I think both Mrs. Figueiredo and yourself, I'll buy both of you a watch, because I think you'll be able to make use of this. 1 minute, but anyway. You're lucky, because Mr. van Dalen wants to put a question to you, so you're going to get another 30 minutes. Mr. van Dalen, go ahead with your blue question. Thank you so much, Chairman. President, you're being so tolerant and prepared to allow me to put this question. Mr. Toussas knows precisely what's wrong, what doesn't work in this system, and everything that's totally wrong in Europe and in all the member states. My question, therefore, sir, so what's the alternative? What do you want to do? You want to go to back to communism, North Korea, Cuba, or possibly other dictatorships? Is that the solution? Is that what you want, sir?
Κύριε Τούσα, 30 δευτερόλεπτα.
Mr. Toussas, 30 minutes, 30 seconds.
I do understand your weakness when making suggestions of this kind. I can understand that you have these ideas, but the Greek Communist Party was against Greek accession to the EU. 30 years on, and look at what has happened. Since 1957, we have seen the European community as a community defending capital on the back of workers.
You can have Mr. Toussas discussing with Mr. van Dalen. And this is just something that we should never lose. Let me go on to Mr. Brons for 1 minute.
Thank you. The Eurozone imposes a single currency value and standardised interest rates on 17 different economies. If the failing countries had remained outside the Eurozone, their currencies would have fallen in value, leading to export-led expansions facilitated by low interest rates that would be set by their central banks. The excessive currency value and now rising interest rates have aggravated stagnation, which has brought about falling tax revenues, cuts in services and rising government debts. It would be in their interest to leave the zone, but the fall in the value of their currencies would then increase their debt burden. Britain, being outside the Eurozone, should be unaffected by these debts, but our previous government underwrote £10 billion of the debts under the exceptional occurrences clause of the Lisbon Treaty, and the present government will continue to supply loans directly and indirectly. Greece and Ireland will eventually default on their debts and will all be shown to have thrown good money after bad. Thank you.
Ο κύριος Ράγγελ για 1,5 λεπτό.
Mr. Rangel.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Commissioner, I'd like to start off by saying that, of course, the agreement that's been reached for Portugal is balanced, and it's very tough for the people of Portugal. But, of course, we have to carry out structural reform to increase competitiveness and growth. And I think that this is positive. I don't have the attitude of others who consider that Greece, Ireland and Portugal have done everything fine, that they haven't been wrong in anything. And it's been the international crisis that created problems. No, our governments have made mistakes. They pursued policies that were wrong. But this doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity in the context of the Union now to come back to the right path. Therefore, I think we have to recall here that, in fact, it's public opinion that are against supporting the countries in difficulties. The money is being lent and at high rates of interest. And so this is good business for our budgets and our peoples. And I would also say that we have to have a European response in the form of issuing Eurobonds in order to respond to the international markets. This will be the time when the European Union and the IMF then should revise interest rates so they can be reduced, and in this way there will be a sustainable growth in the countries in difficulties.
Okay. Mr. Gifford. Mr. Giegold, I'm sorry. 30 seconds question.
Mr. Rangel, so first I would like to say, and I feel ashamed by the amount of nationalisms and short-sightedness which was expressed in this debate. I have a question to you. Do you feel the interest rate which you will have to pay under the future program should be lowered? And would that help your country to lower these interest rates?
O Sr. Giegold, eu acho.
Ms. Giegold. Well, the interest ought to be lower not only for Portugal but for Ireland and Greece. Although with lower interest rates it's going to be difficult to meet the objectives, as we've seen in the Greek case. And in any case, there is one possibility. If Portugal in these first months were able to strictly comply with what's in the agreement, we would have conditions to be able to appear before the EU and the IMF so that they could revise interest rates downward in the next 6 or 9 months. This would be positive for Portugal and for the EU.
So, now we come to the Catch the Eye section. I have 7 names, but I'll be very strict. 1 minute each. Ms. McGuinness first.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just an Irish voice to this debate. I too share disillusionment with the extent of nationalism across this floor. I'm disappointed that the chamber is half empty for what is the most important debate for Europe in this session. On interest rates, let's be very clear that countries should not be charged penal interest rates. It does not help them to recover, and it does not help the debt sustainability. In my last 30 seconds, could I ask the Commission to address the issue of debt sustainability for Ireland and our colleagues who are in difficulty? Could I also ask a question about the political capacity of the European Union? On Monday in our Parliament in Dublin, I spoke about a sundering of solidarity in the European Union. I don't say that with any delight. I've said it privately to the Commissioner. It is a real and serious problem. I rue the day when we might be ruled by the extreme right or the extreme left. For God's sake, let the centre unite. Thank you.
Ms. JAAKONSAARI has 1 minute. Mr. President, thank you. The debate has been useful. This is a difficult situation for the countries in crisis, but it's also difficult for Germany, Austria and Finland, because the taxpayers in these countries have experienced austerity and budget cuts. But it is useful and it is right that Portugal should be seen as a textbook case of how to manage a crisis. Portugal should sell off its assets, reduce its deficit. We need specific ideas. We need to know how this money is to be repaid. In Germany, Austria, Finland, the taxpayers are not going to put up with yet another Greek bailout. Ms. BEњOVÁ has 1 minute. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Commissioner, colleagues. Portugal is the next country that needs European help. We must be frank. Calling this a debt crisis or a crisis of the euro is misleading. It suggests that the euro is in crisis because some member states are not able to manage their budgets and are getting into debt. Portugal was a disciplined country which has suffered from a crisis which it didn't cause. It was the costs of the bank bailout that have got certain Eurozone countries into difficulties. So in fact the crisis is a crisis of the European banking sector. If we're honest, the euro in the post-2013 period is going to be different. Commercial banks are going to have to accept their losses and we'll need proper regulation of the financial sector. Mr. Van Dalen, 1 minute.
President, the way in which the debt crisis is being settled is leading to more difficulties. The countries that are receiving a bailout are going to get more debt, so you're covering debt with more debt. I believe Europe needs to move away from this idea. You could restructure part of the debt if you do that and at the same time have a right approach with sanctions. This is a tough approach. It's a shakeout for banks, for certain pension institutions and those who hold bonds, but that is what we need to do. It's not going to be nice if we don't suffer first, because perhaps you need to really get strict rules. You need to do away with a part of the debt, and if not, the weaker countries will have to leave the Eurozone.
Mr. Portas, 1 minute.
Sr. Comissário, em abril o Presidente da República.
Commissioner, in April, the European Commission was asked to show imagination. And they responded with the arrogance of a colonial government. They said, well, imagine what we've had to do for Portugal. Well, this is why I'm asking for this now. The Commission is using imagination when it imposes on Portugal a government program for 3 years and indicating a government preference. I mean, this country is asking for an interest rate of 6%, and this is going to lead to recession in the next 2 years. The Commission has imagination for what isn't necessary. What we need is to restructure and renegotiate the debt and to involve the creditors in the solution. So please, Commissioner, please resign.
Mr. Obermayr, 1 minute.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender. Ich werde versuchen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unlike my colleagues, I shall try to be brief and concentrate on the budget. There's one thing that's lacking in this debate. What do the taxpayers in the net payer countries think? They're paying 50% taxes. They're making a huge contribution. solidarity should be a two-way street. We should show solidarity with our citizens too. And it wasn't the EU that's helped with budget cuts and cuts in public services. Certain countries just have to learn that without cuts and greater efficiency in public services, they're not going to survive. Thank you. Thank you. And now Commissioner Olli Rehn has 5 minutes to speak.
Mr. President, honourable members, I focus only on one issue because I need my 5 minutes for that. In recent weeks and today in this House, many voices have spoken in favour of debt restructuring in Greece. It sounds very easy and neat. However, I must say that the proponents of sovereign debt restructuring seem to ignore the potentially devastating implications to financial stability in the country itself and in the euro area as a whole, and the consequences, ramifications to economic growth and employment. Let's think about what could be the consequences of debt restructuring. Of course, we are talking about a counterfactual situation, as are the proponents of debt restructuring. But we have enough understanding of the channels of impact on financial stability and economic activity to make a likely and most possible scenario. And this is how it very likely could turn out. Of course, bondholders would take a big hit, that is, households through their savings instruments like pension savings, as well as institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies. Banks would also bear the cost. From last year's bank stress test exercise, we know that the Greek banks hold 48 billion euros of government securities, Greek government bonds. What would happen? A restructuring of sovereign securities would seriously erode their capital base. For instance, even a 30% haircut would mean that a large part of the banking system would end up undercapitalized, while a 50% haircut, which many have advocated, would imply that a large part of the Greek banking system would simply become insolvent. Thus, a debt restructuring in Greece would have major consequences on the soundness of the banking sector in Greece, as well as on any banks having exposure to Greek securities. Now, I do not love banks, nor do I do my job in the first place in order to save them. But it's a fact that such a major banking crisis would lead to a massive credit crunch. It's not kind of a theoretical virtuality, it is a very likely result, a massive credit crunch. Moreover, through rating actions, the collateral pool at the disposal of the Greek banks would most likely be wiped out. It would melt down. Massive credit crunch, possible bank runs, deposit freeze and or capital controls could well be part of the consequences. What is absolutely sure is that the contraction of the economy would be unprecedented in Greece. Let me recall that Argentinian GDP collapsed almost by half over 5 years. Then, would it help Greece or Europe? I doubt. Even a severe haircut as 50% would not reduce the debt ratio below 100% of GDP, assuming that the international creditors, like the euro area member states, the IMF, would be excluded of this haircut. Greece still has a large fiscal deficit, which it has to finance. Who would be ready to lend to Greece the morning after if it wiped out 70 or 50 or 30% of previous investors' financial wealth? Who would be ready to lend to Greece the morning after? Debt restructuring would cut the access of Greece to financial markets for a very long time. And the goal of the EU-IMF programme is indeed a relatively rapid return to the markets to finance the Greek sovereign, so that the European taxpayers do not have to guarantee loans to do that. That's the goal of this exercise. Let's recall that in the final analysis, fiscal solvency requires stabilising and then reducing the government debt ratio, that is achieving a primary structural surplus and achieving a debt stabilising level. Greece is still living beyond its means, and the key is that Greece has to start earning more than it consumes and also be able to pay its interest rates of its debt burden. That's the primary structural surplus what Greece is needing, and debt restructuring would not solve this very fundamental fact. Therefore, in the end of the day, the main determinants of the solvency of Greece are of political and social nature. The consistent rigour to keep the primary surplus stable at a high level of around 5% of GDP for a long period of time. Now we have examples of this. Belgium successfully did so in the 1990s, for almost a decade. Moreover, 6 EU member states have been able to maintain over 4% primary surplus for at least 4 years of time. So it's not impossible. It is certainly very challenging, but it has been done before, and it is doable also for Greece if there is the political will and the unity in the country. And this is the only way for Greece to avoid much worse alternatives. President, honourable members, we are really at a critical juncture concerning the future of Europe. This debate is about the sovereign debt crisis. It has implications on the euro, on the future of Europe. You know it very well. I must say that I am extremely concerned of the divergence in the national debates, national political debates, which we have felt recently, and which has been reflected also in this House. There is political fatigue in Central and Northern Europe to support the countries in trouble. There is the reform fatigue in Southern Europe to do the necessary reforms. Now, we need to find together the energy to beat this fatigue. We need to build bridges over these divergences in order to save Europe. And we need to make the necessary decisions to avoid another even worse crisis and to enable the whole Europe to recover from this extremely serious financial crisis we have experienced in the last years. Thank you.
And now, Mr. Kármán on behalf of Council.
Mr. President, honourable members, let me respond to 2 ideas that were raised during this debate. The banking crisis has undoubtedly contributed to our current economic problems. It would be a mistake not to say it clear and loud that many of the problems were in many of the member states were linked to non-competitiveness oriented policies, fiscal laxity and a lack of coordination. It is therefore clear that we need a comprehensive European response. Two key elements of this, both of which are top priorities of the Hungarian presidency, are the European semester and implementing the reform of economic governance. Both of these priorities should be implemented, and the implementation is in fact at a crucial, critical phase. Concerning the European semester, we are committed to a successful conclusion of the European semester. This should be on the agenda of the June ECOFIN Council, where the national reform programs and stability programs are going to be discussed. Hopefully these programs are going to bring real breakthrough in the budgetary and economic policies of the individual member states. Concerning the six-pack, there is intensive work going on in the framework of the trialogue meetings. Next week's finance ministers meeting is where the Hungarian presidency is going to outline the key points of Parliament's proposal, and at this meeting we're also going to ask for a mandate to be granted by Council in order to be able to bring the negotiations to a fruitful conclusion before the end of June. That's where we want to close the six-pack talks before the end of June. We need flexibility and commitment on both sides, and I'm convinced that an agreement on this issue would be a very positive message both towards the markets and the public, and it would reflect that the European institutions can act swiftly when it's most badly needed. Concerning the Portuguese program and the three readjustment programs, first of all, let me welcome the agreement in the Finnish Parliament. We know how important this European Financial Stability Facility is, and with an agreement in the Finnish Parliament we can now get the facility going. The economic policy program put together by the Troika, both in the case of Portugal, Ireland and Greece, in all three countries, the programs are tailored to the needs and specificities of the individual member states. They are not a one-size-fits-all package. In Ireland, the key element is the consolidation of the banking sector. In Greece, it's focused on the budget, while in Portugal it focuses on the reforms of structural reforms and the labor markets, because it's essential that growth is kick-started and competitiveness improves. I am convinced that these programs entail serious efforts if they are serious about implementing these reform programs, but they also offer a great opportunity to face their old structural problems and come up with the right answers, which in the medium term should contribute to sustainable and higher growth in these three countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. That concludes the debate. Our next agenda item is the Commission statement on the efficiency of the European agencies linked to employment, working conditions and training. I give the floor to Mr. Andor for the Commission for 5 minutes.
Mr. President. Honourable members, I wish to thank this House for putting the issue of European agencies on the agenda. The Commission attaches great importance to the European Union's agencies functioning efficiently. Part of this is related to the governance arrangements which apply to all of them. As you are aware, the agencies' functioning and governance are currently being discussed within the interinstitutional working group involving the Commission, Parliament and the Council on the basis inter alia of a multi-agency evaluation carried out for the Commission in 2009. Indeed, time has come to shape a new overall approach to EU agencies, improving their overall coherence, effectiveness, accountability and transparency. The final aim of the interinstitutional working group is by a step-by-step approach to develop a general agreement between the three EU institutions on the different issues at hand. We hope this can be achieved by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. Cooperation with Parliament has been very positive so far, and we trust that we can count on Parliament's support for the next steps. As you know, EU agencies are legally autonomous bodies whose governance rules are laid down in their funding regulations. In general, agencies are overseen by a governing board whose membership may vary within the nature of the agency. Three of the agencies in the field of employment and education, for example, Eurofund, OSHA and CEDEFOP, have tripartite governing bodies with representatives of both sides of industry, the Member States and also the Commission. I wish to reassure you that this House has access to a lot of information, either because this information is in the public domain or because Parliament, as part of the budgetary authority, holds hearings on the annual work programme and on the budgetary discharge with the directors of agencies in the Employment and Social Affairs Committee. Each of the agencies, Eurofund, OSHA, European Training Foundation and CEDEFOP, has a specific role to play. For example, the European Training Foundation and CEDEFOP, although both working on vocational education and training, have different geographical scope. The former works outside the EU, the latter inside the EU, and they have different objectives. The European Training Foundation assisting essentially the neighbourhood countries with reforms of education and training systems, while CEDEFOP promoting information gathering and research on vocational training policy of the Member States. The Commission is keen to ensure synergies between the two agencies, notably through exchange of information, joint work programme, joint organisation of conferences and seminars and joint projects. Thank you very much.
That's right. Thank you very much. Kyria Gressler, για 2 λεπτά.
2 minutes now from Mrs. Gressler.
Präsident, Herr Kommissar, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Commissioner, colleagues, I would like to welcome you on behalf of my group, and I'd like to say to Commissioner Andor that we appreciate his thanks on our work on the agencies, but the fact that the Council has left this House is such a great shame, because we haven't really been able to do much in terms of the interinstitutional issues related to agencies, and this is because of the Council, because they don't really want to make any improvements. So, Commission, we stand by you, but we must put more pressure or bring more pressure to bear on these agencies. There are 4 agencies, and we've got overlapping of competences, OSHA and Eurofront and the EASA. We have a lot of overlapping between CEDEFOP and EDF. Because of the financial difficulties that exist in Europe, really we need to take steps. Agencies that really have similar responsibilities, for instance the Agency for Vocational Training within Europe and the one outside Europe, maybe we should take those 2 together. There are good reasons for this. We also have problems with the size of these agencies, the efficiency. We have supervisory bodies with more supervisory boards than the agencies themselves. I mean, the European Union is really losing its good reputation, because everybody says, surely this cannot be true. And in some agencies we have the critical size which cannot be reached for efficient work. We've given them too much money, too much staff. In a certain agency,